Thanks. It's my carefully crafted presentation. Who here has heard of the resource curse? 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, blah, blah. Maybe about 10%. Well, we're going to talk about the resource curse now, and in fact, I would suggest that you know the concept, you probably just don't know the label. Resource curse can be expressed as, why can't Nigeria be like Norway? It's the increasing body of evidence which suggests that wherever you get large-scale production of natural resources, oil, gas, gold, copper, diamonds, you tend to get conflict, war, and corruption. So we're going to look at why it's so hard to mitigate and reduce that, and as the title of this talk suggests, give it back. We're going to look at a policy tool, a very, very simple policy tool, which could transform this situation for the 700 million plus people, 10% of the world's population, who suffer from it. But first, I want to tell you a story of how I got into looking at this. A few years ago, I'm a journalist by training, and I went to Iraq to help some colleagues, Iraqi colleagues, try and figure out how they could make money for their news agency. They'd been going for 5 years. They were backed by the United Nations, and they had succeeded against incredible odds to build a news agency. 3 of their reporters were killed. 45 received death threats. They had to negotiate between the American army, Al-Qaeda, the sectarian militias. They did all of that, and they succeeded. But they couldn't make money. So we thought, Iraq, it's an $80 billion a year oil industry. These guys have 90 reporters. Surely they can set up an oil news service which people will pay for, and that's how they solve their business model problem. Well, we were wrong, because as my friend Zuhair said, none of the 90 reporters in Iraq knew the first thing about oil. They weren't able to cover it. These are very smart, very educated, very dedicated people in a country that essentially was created as a series of oil fields in the 1920s at the end of the British Empire. So this stunning lack of public education and public awareness seemed to me to be really closely linked to the fact that governance of oil and gas industries produces such negative outcomes in so many parts of the world. And I decided to become a transparency activist. But by the way, the situation with Iraq is not unique to Iraq, perhaps aggravated by the war. But I was just in Libya last month, and it's the same deal. That's the amount of money that the Gaddafi regime received in petrodollars over 40 years in net current values. It's $1 trillion. And it's a country of 5 million people. I mean, it's the size of Scotland. But most of the roads are unpaved. There's no health services. There's a lot of illiterate people. And in fact, when I was there, I saw a bunch of people queuing outside a kiosk in the middle of the night. I was just walking along, and I went up and asked a man in the queue, "What are you queuing for?" And he said, "I don't know. But whatever it is, we want it." In a country with $1 trillion. I swear, it's just extraordinary. So why can't Nigeria be like Norway? Well, scholars debate this almost endlessly, but at its most simple, you could say that having zillions of dollars spouting out of the ground is a bit like winning the lottery. It seems fantastic, but I don't know how many of you followed the stories about the degrees of family breakups, alcoholism, drug abuse, which happen to most lottery winners. Norway developed its oil industry roughly a century after it got some forms of pluralism, some forms of respect for human rights, civic institutions, what we now call civil society, and elections. In the case of Nigeria and many other countries in the global south, these oil industries were developed by outsiders before their states were either fully formed or in some cases formed at all, and that makes all the difference. So, as I said, I became an activist, and I started to look at the players in the game. Who's in the game of managing the oil and gas industry? What does that tell us? On the top, you have the international players. We have big oil, what I call policy wonks, extremely smart people in the World Bank and the IMF and other development agencies, and some level of transnational activists, people like Transparency International, who are headquartered here in Berlin. On the bottom, we have the local actors. We have autocrats. We have armed actors and agents, warlords, militias. It's very hard often to tell where the politics ends and the extortion begins, but it's all driven by rent-seeking. And we have also local activists, my friends. Now, they look like a really diverse group of people, and they are in every conceivable way, but probably the single most important thing about management of the oil industry, they share in common, and it's this. They're very small groups of people. They're a garden party. About 3 months ago, I sat in a room much smaller than this with all of the transparency activists from Iraq, and I mean all of them. And we discussed how to work with a number of international initiatives. And did anyone hear anything I said? But literally, all in one hotel conference room. And as long as we have a garden party of activists, we're stuffed. So the point about citizen dividend is what we need instead is this. We need a football stadium of activists. We don't need 50 activists in Iraq. We need 50,000. When you have a football stadium of activists, the substance of different policy solutions which are proposed by such clever people is not irrelevant, but it's secondary because you need them first. In that list of actors we saw before, the public doesn't figure. So, that brings us to the concept of a citizen dividend. What is it? Well, what you say is that every adult citizen in the country, you take a package of petrodollars and you allocate it as a flat citizen dividend. It's very important that it's flat because it's based on rights. It's not based on welfare. There's no means testing here. A billionaire gets a citizen dividend just as much as a family in a shantytown. That's a very important political principle. The idea then is to strengthen the relationship between the citizens and the natural resources, which, by the way, their constitutions say they already own. So we modeled this in Iraq. If you were to do this in Iraq, you could right now very happily devise for next year $250 for every man and woman in the country. And because Iraq's oil production is rising, you could make that rise to $1,000 without current government spending even being affected. But the point about it, development economists like to get very excited about this kind of thing because they say, well, it could cut or eliminate poverty, and it could in Iraq. 20% of Iraqis live in poverty. As Henry said earlier, impoverishment is a feature of natural resource-dependent economies. You could do all kinds of interesting things with microfinance, with nudge policies, top-up funds, discretionary by the government for savings. There's a whole bunch of stuff you could do which would have an enormous development impact. But those are beneficial side effects. The main point is the politics. And the money is only an envelope. The money is an envelope for this. And this is a report card. It's actually my video subscription card, but a business card-sized laminated card you can put in your wallet, which details government expenditure, how much was spent on health, how much was spent on education, what the Prime Minister earns. You can easily customize this, so you know what your town mayor earns, what the budget of your daughter's school is. All on one report card. The money is simply a signal. It's a signal for the message, and the message is you are the sovereign owners of your resources. Now, of course, the government could put this out without a dividend, but nobody would believe it. But with enough money to make people sit up, people will either believe it or, better, contest it. Now, how do we get to a football stadium? There's 15 million adult Iraqis. If we said that 1% of them, just 1%, and that would be the equivalent of 3 people in this room. If I gave every one of you $1,000 as a result of some complex procedure that I claimed you were involved in, and 3 of you decided to look at the report card and ask a question or join an association or sign a petition, 1% would be 150,000 people. But let's be even more conservative and assume that half of that doesn't go anywhere. Well, that gives you 75,000, and that gives you Wembley. That's how you get a football stadium of activists. And it's the single most important thing. We've been asking the wrong question. We've been asking, what do we need to do to improve governance of oil and gas industries? The question we need to ask is, who do we bring to the table? We bring the people to the table. So you could say, well, that's just Iraq. Iraq's drowning in oil. That's maybe another dozen countries like that, but it's not the most typical profile of oil and gas producers. There's a lot of countries in Africa which produce oil and gas, but they're not drowning in oil. They need every dollar. The government needs every dollar. So Iraq isn't typical. Except that there's another thing that is typical of countries which produce oil and gas at all levels of production, which is that they tend to subsidize and give away oil and gas free. They're not responsive to their publics in general. There is no social contract, or it was broken decades ago, but there are these zillions of dollars spouting out of this one point in the ground, and it's pretty easy to just put some in a tank and distribute it free. Now, those policies began decades ago. Populations have grown since. If we take Egypt, the value of oil and gas subsidies in Egypt is greater than the entire amount the government spends on every hospital, every health clinic, and every school combined. And it's not unusual. There are half a dozen other countries like that. Not only that, but fuel subsidies are anti-poor, not pro-poor. Why? Because you need capital in order to have the infrastructure to use the fuel. If electricity was free, you'd still need $400 to buy a refrigerator. If petrol was free, you'd still need $10,000 to buy a pickup truck. The guy on the right is a crony capitalist who set up an aluminum smelting factory based on free gas and oil because he knew the son of the president. If you swap out the subsidies and you swapped in a citizen dividend, a flat citizen dividend, it would be what economists call fiscally progressive. The poor would become slightly better off, the middle class would become slightly worse off, and about 50 crony capitalists would go out of business. It would be a socially progressive measure. When you take the Iraq use case and the Egypt use case, you're looking at 20 countries. There are other use cases. The IMF estimates there's about 35 countries around the world which are natural resource dependent. You have this whole bunch of use cases, but then you face the question of, well, how can you possibly persuade anyone in power, all of these vested interests, to give it up? So you need to find windows. The subsidies, by the way, might be its own window. In Iran, they are thinking about where they suffer similar levels of subsidy and a crippling of their social services. They are already heading in this direction. So subsidies could be its own window. Other windows can be electoral cycles, where a candidate may seek for their own advantage to make a direct connection to an electorate, which gives them a mandate to tackle vested interests once they're in office. Other cases might even be legacy shopping. An incumbent is going to leave office soon. what could be cooler than to go down in your country's history as the guy who ended poverty? So, if you take 40 countries and their various use cases, and if you look for windows, I'm not saying it's ever going to be easy, but in the space of 5 years, you can find 1, 2, 3 countries where it might work, where political actors want to try it, and they implement it, and then you get precedent. And once you have precedent, what seems unthinkable, that people could have direct control over their own resources, becomes simply the edge of innovation, and from there it becomes normative, and within a decade it could become the norm. So, if this is such a good idea, why hasn't it been tried? Well, it's worth pointing out, I mentioned Iran's kind of stuttering progress, it's worth pointing out that the state of Alaska has had a citizen dividend since the early 1980s. It's a very different context, although it's worth also pointing out that Alaska has the lowest differential between poor and rich of any of the American states. But the main arguments against a citizen dividend essentially revolve around lack of trust of people. Sorry, I'm just going to... Technical experts argue that you can't give people something for free because then they won't work. I have 2 objections to that. I mean, one is that seems like we want to export the Protestant work ethic to the rest of the world. It's a form of cultural imperialism. But secondly, they already own these resources. They're already theirs. You're not giving them anything. The second line of argument says that poor people particularly can't manage finances, but there's an increasing body of literature which says that actually financial management amongst the more than 1 billion people who live in the informal sector around the world is more complex and more volatile. It involves a wider range of revenue streams than most of us here in this room. And the poor certainly stack up well against typical government management of expenditure, particularly out of natural resource industries. They don't face the moral hazard question. You have to figure out how you're going to send all of your kids to school. So those arguments are largely patronizing in my view. Once you have a citizen dividend, you have the football stadium. Once you have the football stadium, everything else about the way that we've come to see the oil industry and its management and its effect on people changes. Thank you.